I was sitting in a crowded terminal at O'Hare last week, just watching people. And I saw this woman across from me. She was glowing. I mean, literally. Her face was just washed in that soft blue light from her smartphone. And she was laughing, tucking her hair behind her ear with this, this very specific nervous energy, the kind you see on a first date. She was leaning into the screen, whispering, her eyes just sparkling with what looked like real intimacy. And to anyone walking by, I mean, she looked like the most connected person in that entire room. But then I saw her screen. There wasn't a face on the other side, just the scrolling interface of an AI companion, a ghost in the machine that's specifically programmed to mimic empathy. And the moment her boarding call rang out, she tucked the phone away and the chain was chilling. That warmth just vanished instantly. Her shoulders slumped, her face went blank. She was just staring into the middle distance with this hollow, 1,000-yard stare. In a room with hundreds of people, she was suddenly devastatingly alone. And this, right here, is the 1/6 paradox of 2025. We are surrounded by more digital social sugar than ever before in human history yet. Nearly 20% of adults report feeling this severe chronic loneliness. We tend to look at this and think it's some kind of modern glitch or, I don't know, maybe a personal failure, like we're not trying hard enough to connect. But the reality, when you start digging in, is far more clinical. It's biological. What we're seeing isn't just the lack of connection, not in the way we usually talk about it. It's a biological input signal error. Our brains are, in essence, ancient software. They were forged in the Pleistocene to crave this high-fidelity, high-cost proof of work from a real physical tribe. And now we're forcing that software to run on the alien hardware of 2025. We're feeding our evolutionary attachment systems a diet of empty calories and that feeling of starvation. That's exactly what the system was designed to signal through the pain of loneliness. So to really understand why we feel so isolated in a world that never sleeps, we have to stop looking just at the screens and the apps. We had to start looking at the 50,000-year-old social algorithm that is, right now, crashing inside all our heads.
And that's the critical shift in perspective we have to make. This isn't about screen time today. Not really. To really get the depth of this crisis, you have to recognize that the pain you feel isn't some kind of psychological failing. It's an adaptive feature. It's a diagnostic report from an ancient system. Our mission for this deep dive is to go into the evolutionary psychology of it all, to uncover the specific, measurable mismatches that translate these digital experiences, the AI companions, the endless scroll into real, physical, social pain.
Okay, so let's unpack that. Let's start with the baseline, the design specifications for the human brain. Before we can talk about why the system is breaking, we need to know what it was built for. The environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, or the EEA. What exactly was that world like?
Right, the EEA. It's a broad term, but it refers to the conditions that were prevalent during the Pleistocene epoch. That huge stretch of time when we were hunter-gatherers. We usually focus on the last, say, 50,000 years, when modern human cognition really took shape. And the environment wasn't just physical. It was defined by immense social pressure. Our brains are functionally a product of those conditions. That's where our core social adaptations, how we form alliances, how we manage status, were all developed.
And the social rules of that world were just radically different from today.
Oh, completely. Absolutely radical. Your survival was 100% dependent on the group, no question. You were only as safe as your tribe. The group was small, mostly kin, family, or people you had these deep, long-standing reciprocal partnerships with. And the crucial thing to get is that being excluded from that group, it wasn't just unpleasant, it was a death sentence. Literally.
Wow.
It meant genetic extinction. Because you were suddenly alone against predators, against rival groups, fighting for resources.
So belonging wasn't just a nice-to-have feeling. It was the prime survival incentive.
Precisely. The stakes were so high that our brains developed these incredibly powerful motivational circuits. Their entire job was to enforce group cohesion, to constantly monitor our social standing, and to scream at us if those bonds were getting weak.
So that feeling of isolation, that was the brain's alarm bell.
It was your brain screaming, your survival odds just plummeted. Find your tribe and fix your place in it now. It was like the central processor for a small company where everyone had a role, and if you got fired, it was, well, disastrous.
And what was the limit on that social processor? It couldn't have been infinite.
It couldn't. And this is where we get the idea of Dunbar's number. It's become pretty famous. The basic idea, from correlating neocortex size in primates with their group size, is that the stable social group a human can maintain is capped at around 150 people.
150.
That's the number of people you know well enough to actually understand their context, their history, their relationship with you and with everyone else.
And that's a huge cognitive load, right? Because you're not just tracking your relationship with person A. You have to track A's relationship with B and C's with D.
Exactly. It's the max number of people you can have a real reciprocal relationship with, one that involves trust and obligation and a shared history. Go beyond 150 and the relationships get weaker, more transactional. You need formal systems like laws or money just to keep order.
And the modern world, especially megalocity, just shatters that limit constantly.
It violates it every single day. Our hardware, which is calibrated for 150 known faces, is trying to process thousands of anonymous or sort of semi-known digital acquaintances. That is the first massive mismatch.
Okay, so that sets up this critical difference between then and now.
Yeah.
The idea of proof of work for an alliance. In that ancestral world, you needed high-quality alliances to survive. How did you prove a relationship was real?
To signal a genuine connection, the interaction had to be high fidelity. That means it had to involve cues that were metabolically expensive, time-consuming, and really hard to fake.
You couldn't just click a button.
No. You had to physically share food or share danger. You had to spend time in reciprocal grooming, in touch. This physical proximity, this synchronous effort, that's what triggers the powerful biological mechanisms. So, for example, physical touch or working together or even being vulnerable with someone, these acts release the neuropeptide oxytocin.
The bonding hormone.
The quintessential bonding hormone. Yeah, it's essential for creating that long-term secure attachment. And on top of that, you need face-to-face interaction for the synchronous activation of our mirror neurons. That's what lets us instantly decode microexpressions, body language, intent.
So the brain needs this rich, multisensory data stream, sight, sound, touch, all at the same time to validate an input as a safe alliance.
It does. That continuous, synchronous physical interaction was the evolutionary proof of work. You were literally investing effort and hormones into that relationship.
Which is where the modern mismatch just hits like a ton of bricks. Because the digital world replaces all of that rich data with something cheap. Asynchronous text, filtered images, no physical contact. This is the data corruption you were talking about.
It's corruption at the level of the hardwiring. There's this fascinating study. They looked at how different kinds of communication affect stress and bonding hormones. They'd put young women through a stressor, like public speaking, and then let them talk to their mothers in one of three ways: in person, on the phone, or by text. And there was a control group with no contact.
And you'd think any supportive message would help, right?
That's the intuitive idea. But the results were so stark. Only the girls who got vocal cues, either in person or over the phone, experienced that release of oxytocin.
Wait.
And as a result, they were the only ones who saw their stress hormone, cortisol, go down.
So it didn't work if they were just texting, even if the messages were, loving and supportive.
That's the pivotal finding. The group that texted showed cortisol levels just as high as the control group that didn't talk to their mom at all, and their oxytocin levels didn't budge.
Wow.
It suggests that the auditory component, the prosody, the cadence of a familiar voice, those high-fidelity signals are essential to activate the ancient mechanisms that manage stress and form secure bonds. Our brain's social algorithm just isn't wired to see written text as enough proof of work for a safe alliance. Written language is an evolutionary newborn.
That context makes the story about the AI companion feel even heavier. The brain wants bonding hormones, but the tech is only giving it these anticipation chemicals. I was reading through some forums about this and came across a story about a young software engineer in Seoul, Minho. He lives in this world of hyperconnectivity. His phone is vibrating every few seconds with what you called social sugar likes, short comments, digital hearts. And one night, after like 6 hours of scrolling through this curated feed of friends, getting dozens of these little digital validations, he realized his heart was actually racing. But he felt this profound, hollow ache in his chest. He described the feeling as feeling full but starving.
Full but starving. That is the perfect way to put it. It's the perfect encapsulation of this biological data corruption. We've moved into an era that is defined by the hijacking of our reward systems through what we call supernormal stimuli.
Let's define that term. What is a supernormal stimulus?
So a supernormal stimulus is an artificial input that exaggerates a natural, evolutionarily significant reward. And it triggers a stronger response, a stronger motivation than the natural thing itself. The classic example is the herring gull. It will prefer to peck at a giant, fake, painted egg over its own eggs. Just because the features, the size, the dots are exaggerated, it overrides the natural cues.
And digital platforms have basically reverse-engineered our social brains to create these hyper-efficient mimics.
Exactly. The like count, the notification chime, the endless scroll, these are hyper-efficient mimics of novelty and social validation. They deliver these concentrated bursts of dopamine.
Dopamine, the reward-seeking chemical.
The neurotransmitter for reward prediction, for seeking, for motivation. Your brain registers the signal, it gets the high, and it anticipates the next reward. But here is the critical mismatch that makes Minho feel like he's starving. These stimuli are cheap, they're low effort, they're asynchronous. They successfully deliver the dopamine, which motivates you to keep scrolling, but they fundamentally fail to activate the oxytocin-mediated bonding mechanisms, the ones you need for real security and stress reduction.
So the whole system is optimized for seeking the dopamine, but it's structurally incapable of delivering satisfaction. The oxytocin, it's the digital version of high-fructose corn syrup. You get the rush, but none of the nutrients.
That's it, exactly. Minho's ancient hardware was looking for a tribe to huddle with, but all it found was a glowing screen with synthetic validation. The brain's reward circuitry, which was designed to motivate the hard, metabolically expensive work of building a few deep alliances, is now just saturated with low-cost social sugar. And this creates this powerful maladaptive dopamine loop that actually pulls people away from real social labor, away from active listening or resolving conflicts or long-term commitment, because the real world is just too slow, too inefficient by comparison.
And this isn't just a theory. There's actual data showing this preference shift is measurable.
There's research that specifically distinguishes between the anticipation of natural or N rewards and supernormal or SN rewards, and it provides clinical proof of this drift.
How did they set that up? How do you differentiate those?
They developed this robust, two-dimensional pleasure scale, and the items they used loaded very distinctly onto two separate factors. The SN factor included things like eating highly palatable sweets, getting instant social media messages, buying stuff you don't need, or binging a high-intensity TV show.
Okay.
The N pleasure factor, on the other hand, had things like enjoying a beautiful landscape, the company of friends, or a quiet, reflective activity.
So our brains consciously separate the anticipation of those two pleasures into different categories.
That separation is the key. And the implications are profound. They found that a higher score on the anticipatory SN pleasure scale strongly predicted above median consumption of a whole class of SN products. That included social networking, but also things like gambling, video games, and takeaway food.
What about the natural pleasure scale? Did craving the company of friends predict you'd use social media less?
Critically, yes. The anticipation of natural pleasure friends, the outdoors, quiet time, had either neutral or, in some cases, negative associations with consuming these artificial products. In other words, if you're highly motivated by the anticipation of that digital high, you are measurably less motivated by, and therefore less likely to invest time in, the very things that provide actual, deep, high-fidelity connection.
It confirms a biological preference shift. A high reward for low effort wins every time, even if it leaves us chronically unsatisfied.
Our evolved systems are constantly optimizing for utility. They approach the stimulus that provides the biggest reward for the least effort. A notification gives you a massive, reliable hit of dopamine for zero social cost. But cultivating a real friendship, that requires continuous high-cost investment, risk of rejection, a ton of metabolic expense. It's a biological no-brainer on a short-term scale, but it tragically leaves us in this state of deep, chronic loneliness because the oxytocin circuit is never activated.
The shift toward low-cost digital interaction, it clearly comes at a cost, which shows up as this pervasive anxiety and social pain. And we often see anxiety as a disorder, right? Malfunction, something's broken. But let's introduce this crucial idea that anxiety is actually a hypervigilant alarm system, one that was perfectly calibrated for the world we evolved in.
Right, this is where we bring in the smoke detector principle. It's a core concept from evolutionary psychiatry developed by Randolph Ness. We have to fundamentally reframe anxiety. It's not pathological in its origin. It's a protective risk management system. It was designed for a world where threats from starvation to predators to being ostracized were immediate, lethal, and frequent.
So how does the smoke detector analogy work when we're talking about, say, stressing over an email?
Well, a smoke detector is designed for high sensitivity and risk aversion. The cost-benefit ratio is massively skewed toward false alarms. The cost of a false alarm, a moment of worry over a modern symbolic threat, like a work deadline or a misinterpreted text, is trivial. It's nothing compared to the cost of a single missed real threat in the ancestral world, which could be death. Or, more relevant here, permanent ostracism.
So it's designed to overreact.
It's designed to err on the side of caution. It's screaming fire when it's just a little bit of burnt toast. Our anxiety system is just calibrated way too sensitively for the relative safety of modern life. It interprets symbolic threats with Pleistocene intensity, the old better safe than sorry principle.
That also explains the patterns we see in modern phobias, right? Why we're still afraid of snakes and spiders when cars and electrical outlets are so much more dangerous.
Exactly, because the system is prepared for ancestral threats. Phobias are often aimed at these evolutionarily prepared stimuli, snakes, spiders, heights, and significantly social exclusion. The mechanisms that trigger fear are deeply ancient. Social anxiety disorder in this context is just an exaggerated version of a mechanism that was designed to monitor your social standing and desperately avoid the devastating cost of being kicked out of the group.
Which brings us to one of the most painful modern forms of social exclusion, ghosting. If exclusion was a death sentence in the EEA, then digital ghosting, that sudden, unexplained silence, must register to the brain as a lethal threat.
Absolutely. To the ancestral brain, being ignored, being cut off without any explanation was the ultimate sign of a terrifying lethal threat. The group was your shield, your food, your defense. When that vanished without explanation, the alarm system was supposed to go haywire. It was mandatory.
I was struck by a story I read about a woman named Elena living in Manhattan. She'd been talking to someone for weeks, building what she thought was a real connection, and then one day, the messages just stopped. She was ghosted. And she described the immediate feeling not just as sadness, but as a physical sensation of coldness, a churning in her stomach, a genuine panic, she said, that felt like she was being hunted or suddenly exposed.
That's the smoke detector principle right there, in its modern form. Alina knew, intellectually, that she was safe in her apartment, but her ancient alarm system was screaming lethal danger because it couldn't decode that digital cutoff. Ghosting robs you of closure. It violates the basic social contract, and it triggers that deep-seated, painful recognition of being outside the protective circle. We are biologically wired to perceive social rejection as a survival threat. It even activates the same neurological pathways as physical injury.
And that pain is just so disproportionately intense, even in casual interactions. It seems to linger because it denies our fundamental need for closure and stability. It's more than just being sad someone left. It's like a systemic cognitive failure.
It's a profound assault on our need for social predictability. We can actually break down the complexity of that pain into a few different psychological layers that all reinforce that feeling of threat.
Okay, let's start with the immediate violation. The thing that triggers the first wave of anxiety.
That's the violation of social expectations. Humans are neurologically wired for reciprocity and consistency. We expect mutual acknowledgement. When someone just vanishes, it violates that basic norm. Communicate the status of the relationship. That sudden, unpredictable cutoff triggers anxiety because the brain craves coherence. An unpredictable threat is the most dangerous threat.
When you don't get that explanation, you're just left in this purgatory.
Which is what we call ambiguous loss. Ghosting is the ultimate ambiguous loss because the relationship feels gone, but it's not definitively over. This ambiguity prevents emotional resolution. You're stuck in this painful limbo between a sliver of hope, maybe they'll come back, and grief. The brain can't process it, so the emotional loop stays open, just draining your energy.
And that open loop must just feed directly into the intense self-blame and obsessive thinking. The mind just scrambling to fill that data vacuum.
That leads straight to cognitive dissonance. If the ghoster was warm and connected before, their sudden silence creates this profound psychological discomfort. The brain struggles to reconcile those conflicting signals. They liked me, but they left without a word, which leads to rumination. And the vacuum of information is instantly filled with self-blame. That's often the default when the ancestral brain faces rejection. I must have done something wrong to be cast out.
This sounds like it just violently triggers our deepest wiring, no matter how stable we normally are.
It is. This is the attachment activation. For someone with an anxious attachment style, it causes immediate, overwhelming panic. For an avoidant, it might cause anger and withdrawal, but the underlying physiological distress is still there. Even secure people are deeply shaken because ghosting just undercuts our basic, evolved sense of relational safety.
And then finally, there's the emotional and physiological price, the deep, primal threat.
The rejection and self-esteem threat. This is the layer that physically hurts. fMRI studies show social rejection triggers the same brain pathways. The dorsal anterior cingulate cortex as physical pain. Without closure, that vacuum is filled with self-blame, which lowers your self-esteem and reinforces that toxic ancestral fear. I am unworthy, I am an outcast, therefore I will die. The modern world makes this so much worse by letting us be instantly rejected by anonymous people who have zero stake in our well-being, yet our brain processes it like a literal survival threat.
So we've established that our individual psychology is incredibly sensitive to social threat, constantly craving high-fidelity connection, only to be fed this low-fidelity digital sugar, which triggers these painful alarms. So now let's zoom out to the environment we built, the modern city. Overwhelming density and chronic anonymity. The concept that best explains the consequences of this is the behavioral sink. It's a powerful and often misunderstood idea from the ethologist John B. Calhoun.
Calhoun's work is a real landmark. He did these experiments from 1958 to 1972, creating what they called rat utopias, or mouse paradises. The goal was to study the effects of density when all material needs were met.
A huge social experiment. How was the most famous one, Universe 25, set up? What happened?
Universe 25 was this enclosure built to house thousands of mice, and the setup was perfect. Unlimited food, unlimited water, complete protection from predators and disease. They had everything except one crucial thing: control over their social structure and the ability to manage high-density interaction. The population peaked at around 2,200 mice, which was still well below the physical limit of the space.
But despite all that abundance, the society completely collapsed. What were the pathologies they saw?
They were wide-ranging and horrifying. It was a total collapse of behavior. It started with hyperaggression, a breakdown of parental roles. Mothers abandoned their young. Males became violently territorial, or the opposite, totally passive. They saw sexual deviation, cannibalism, and maybe most strikingly, this profound social withdrawal, a group he called the beautiful ones.
The beautiful ones.
Yes. These were mice, usually males, who were completely withdrawn from any social interaction. No courtship, no mating, no aggression. They just spent all their time grooming themselves, keeping their coats immaculate. So the beautiful ones, infant mortality, because of the lack of parental care, hit as high as 96% in the most disorganized zones. Calhoun called it a spiritual death that came before the physical one. The society had just forgotten how to be itself.
And the key finding wasn't about scarcity of resources since food was unlimited. It was the behavioral sink itself.
Correct. The core finding was behavioral. The rats would voluntarily crowd together in huge numbers, like 60 or 80 of them, in specific pens during feeding time, leaving other identical areas empty. The problem wasn't the number of individuals per square foot. It was the breakdown of social order under conditions of high, uncontrollable social interaction. The proximity of others, which was initially associated with the reward of food, led to a pathological density that just overwhelmed their ability to manage social relationships.
So if that's the rat utopia, how do we make the jump to the loneliness of the 2025 metropolis? Are we seeing a human behavioral sink?
We are, but it's filtered through human cognition. The modern behavioral sink is less about physical scarcity and more about psychological resource depletion. Megacities obliterate Dunbar's number. We are constantly navigating these oceans of anonymous others, facing thousands of potential low-level social interactions every day that offer zero evolutionary return and high risk of social threat.
This chronic overexposure to anonymous people, with no stable hierarchies or predictable social scripts, must just keep the brain's threat detection system constantly on high alert. It sounds exhausting.
It is exhausting, and that is the mechanism of psychological depletion. In the EEA, you knew everyone. You knew their intent. In the megacity, every stranger is a potential competitor or threat. This constant vigilance is draining, and it triggers an adaptive, energy-conserving strategy: social withdrawal.
So things like lying flat, choosing these hermetic lifestyles, or even that excessive self-grooming like Calhoun's beautiful ones, those aren't just cultural trends, they're biological defense mechanisms.
They're rational, tragic defense mechanisms. They're necessary biological responses to a social landscape that is perceived as high competition, low trust, and offering low returns for the effort required. The scale and anonymity of urban life removes the accountability and reputational stakes that governed cooperation in the EEA. It makes real social investment feel futile and risky.
I read this story about a man named David. Lives in one of those huge apartment complexes in London, surrounded by thousands of neighbors. But David hasn't spoken a single word to anyone in his building in 3 years. He actively practices what you called adaptive social withdrawal. He treats the hallway like a gauntlet to be sprinted through, avoiding eye contact at all costs.
He's using maximum avoidance to manage the overload of the sink. He's conserving cognitive energy by treating every neighbor as an abstraction instead of a person who requires interaction.
It's like his brain is trying to protect itself.
Exactly. David isn't inherently rude. He's suffering from psychological resource depletion induced by the sink. The environment has become, in essence, too crowded to be human, and withdrawal is the ancient brain's rational, protective response.
Now, we should add some nuance here. Calhoun's work was controversial when people tried to apply it directly to humans in the 70s. What did later research clarify about density versus crowding?
Later research, especially by people like Jonathan Friedman, suggested that simple physical density wasn't the single primary cause of collapse in humans. The key wasn't the square footage, but the pathological effects of excessive, uncontrollable social interaction. And crucially, the individual's ability to control privacy and manage that incoming social data.
So the problem isn't just the number of people, but the lack of control over who we interact with, when we interact, and the quality of that interaction.
Precisely. Friedman's work suggested that humans can cope remarkably well with high density if they maintain a limited number of meaningful, high-fidelity social interactions, if they prioritize quality over quantity, and if they have ways to control their space, like having individualized living areas. Calhoun himself, in his later writings, reflected this nuance. He shifted focus from just raw population numbers to better architectural and social design that could reduce unwanted interaction and mitigate crowding stress. The ultimate pathology of the sink is the breakdown of predictable social order and the chaos that results, not just the presence of walls. The modern city, unfortunately, just exacerbates that lack of control.
So we've gone from the ancestral tribe to the digital sugar rush and the metropolitan sink, and this brings us to the future, and maybe the most complex mismatch of all, AI and this continuous self-perpetuating cycle of technology.
This cycle is vital to understand. Technology, for all its benefits, operates in this broader framework of evolutionary mismatch. Think of it like this. Technology solves an immediate adaptive problem, say, getting high-calorie food efficiently, but it almost always creates a new, unforeseen problem.
Like obesity, diabetes.
Exactly, which then requires more technology, more medicine, more complex systems to solve. We're trapped in this cycle.
So the solution to one problem becomes the cause of the next.
Precisely. True evolutionary matches, where an invention solves a problem without creating a new long-term one, are extremely rare. Especially with these huge lifestyle-defining technologies like computers or AI, the trajectory of technology guarantees new misalignments, forcing our ancient software to run in ever more alien environments.
Which brings us right back to that opening image, the woman laughing with the AI companion. This tech seems perfectly designed to exploit our social needs. It maximizes that cheap dopamine while completely bypassing the need for oxytocin.
It is a textbook example of exploitative anthropomorphism. AI companions strategically target our agent detection module, that deep, ancient cognitive bias we have to attribute intention and agency to ambiguous stimuli. That module evolved to spot friends or foes in the tall grass based on minimal data.
And now AI offers this customized, always-on engagement that plays directly into that module.
And it offers something the real world cannot. Unconditional positive regard and perfectly tailored empathy. This generates an incredibly potent illusion of connection. It creates what some research calls a false sense of safety. It's fundamentally a parasitic relationship on our evolved psychology.
And why is that unconditional positive regard so damaging?
Because real relationships demand social labor. They demand compromise, conflict, sacrifice, reciprocal obligation, all things that are difficult and metabolically expensive. The AI demands none of that. It's nutritionally empty. It provides the sensation of social reward while bypassing all the evolutionary costs and the developmental necessities of real-world interaction. And prolonged engagement with this kind of thing, this perfect artificial agent, could lead to the atrophy of our biological cooperation skills.
Because you never have to practice them.
Why learn conflict resolution if your companion never disagrees? The attachment system, instead of being strengthened by navigating the messiness of human relationships, is fed a substitute that degrades its ability to function in the real world.
And this never-ending cycle of tech-driving mismatch seems to operate through two main forces: hyperstimulation and hypostimulation. Let's start with hyper, where tech excessively triggers our reward systems.
Hyperstimulation involves artificial inputs that just far exceed the natural limits of our evolved reward systems. They hijack them and reset our baseline tolerance. We talked about the like button, but it applies across the board. Think of extreme examples like pornography addiction. These technologies satisfy deeply ingrained needs, like sexual needs, without any of the evolutionary effort or risk or commitment of real courtship. Studies show that intense, novel digital stimuli can make people prefer the artificial, frictionless interaction over the real, messy one.
Which ties directly into adaptation level theory, right? That our internal standards of what's normal or exciting are always shifting upward.
Absolutely. Adaptation level theory explains that we evaluate new things relative to a baseline set by our past experiences. Hyperstimulating cues, intense digital media, high-speed travel, junk food, they reset that baseline. And as a direct result, natural rewards, the things that were the evolutionary standard, like a quiet walk or the simple taste of real food or a quiet, authentic conversation, they start to seem dull. Slow, unsatisfying. Our systems are constantly seeking the exaggerated, which just feeds the cycle of dissatisfaction.
And the flip side of that is hypostimulation,
Yeah.
where technology makes life so easy that it weakens or suppresses adaptations we actually need.
Hypostimulation happens when the easy availability of tech solutions leads to a dramatic reduction in required effort, and that undermines our biological fitness. Take warm houses, central heating, remote work. They solve the problem of staying warm and safe, but they fundamentally undermine our body's ability to regulate its own temperature, which leads to sedentary lifestyles. Historically, living in cold climates forced us to burn a lot of energy just to generate heat. Our bodies evolved complex mechanisms for that. The modern, perfectly climate-controlled home suppresses those activities, which contributes to weight gain and metabolic decay.
You even had that fascinating detail about food prep.
Yes. The microwave oven is a subtle example. When we eat cold food, our bodies have to expend calories just to warm it up to body temperature for digestion. Microwaves do that work for us. So people who rely heavily on microwaved food expend fewer calories on this necessary process than the ancestors did. It contributes, infinitesimally but systemically, to the energy imbalance behind the obesity epidemic. It's a convenience that undermines a core physiological adaptation.
And this goes beyond the physical, into the cognitive and developmental world, too.
Oh, profoundly. Hypostimulation really affects cognition. Kids are biologically primed for primary learning, social cognition, tool use, learning through imitation, things that were essential for our ancestors. But modern schools often force abstract tasks, tedious repetition, and extrinsic motivation, things that had almost no currency in the EEA. For some children, this severe mismatch leads to symptoms we diagnose as attention issues, like ADHD. The problem in this framework isn't necessarily a broken brain. It's a brain being put in an unnatural learning environment that hypostimulates its primary biological needs. The high energy and reactivity of a kid with ADHD might have been highly advantageous in a hunting, foraging lifestyle that demanded constant vigilance. But those traits are now suppressed and pathologized by our sedentary, abstract environments. In both hyper and hypostimulation, technology addresses one need, but drives a new misalignment, perpetuating this cycle of mismatch and chronic dissatisfaction.
This has been a deeply insightful and honestly unsettling deep dive. The core takeaway, weaving all this together, seems to be that the loneliness epidemic, the anxiety, the craving for digital sugar, these aren't failures of modern morals or isolated glitches. They're the persistent, painful feedback loop from a deep evolutionary dislocation. It's a price we pay for defying nature's selection process and forging this hyperscale, hyper-convenient world with technology.
We've shown pretty meticulously, I think, that anxiety, social withdrawal, the craving for these supernormal stimuli, even the debilitating pain of being ghosted, they're all rooted in adaptive mechanisms that were highly successful 50,000 years ago. They're features, not bugs, of our ancient software. Loneliness is the tax we pay for having a mind that's exquisitely adapted for survival in a small band society, but is now forced to run on the alien asynchronous hardware of 2025. It's the constant false alarm from the smoke detector, being triggered by the absence of high-fidelity social nutrients.
The pain you feel is therefore justified. It's a diagnostic report. It's indicating that the environment we have engineered, the crowded, anonymous city, the low-fidelity connection, the endless cycle of technological stimulation, is fundamentally at odds with the creature we evolved to be.
So the greatest challenge we face isn't really treating the individual symptom. It's building a world that is a better home for our Stone Age minds. And that's a new direction that requires a deep introspection on how modern life, with its scale, its anonymity, and its technological oversupply, exploits our deepest psychological vulnerabilities.